Hello and welcome to Force.comcast episode 12, Writing Restful Web Services with Apex. So this is the second part of our multi-part series on Restful Web Services in Force.com, and in this week's episode we're going to be writing or looking through some code I've written which is a Restful web service written in Apex. So rather than spend time writing out in the video, I've written up an example here and we're going to go through it and see how it works. So the first thing we've defined here is just a standard Apex class called the language service class, and you can see here that the first thing we have is a resource mapping. So the way Apex REST works is for you to be able to go to a particular URL, you provide a URL mapping, and we'll see how that translates in a minute. So the URL mapping, you can only have one URL mapping for each class, and the class that is having this REST resource annotation has to be a global class. And the mapping must start with a /, such as /languages here, and you can have wildcards within the URL to capture things such as IDs, as we'll be seeing in a minute, but they must be preceded by a /, and they must also be followed by a / unless the wildcard character is the end character as we've got here. So the URL mapping we've got here is the /languages/ and then a wild star. So this is going to be a standard RESTful web service where we'll be calling the languages resource to retrieve either a set of languages, a single language, creating a language, updating a language, or deleting a language. And the language in question is a programming language. So we've just got a custom object called language _c, and it has a name and a type. And so we'll work with that in a minute. So Apex allows you 4 or 5 different annotations, for using in your classes, and we'll go through all of those in a minute. And what you do is you apply an annotation to a particular method, and when a resource matching that URL, or when a call matching that URL for the resource mapping is found, it will then call the correct method. So if you call a get method on the /languages/ and then anything matching the wildcard, it will call this first method here called getLanguages. The naming of these actual methods is not very important. Try and use a standardized naming convention if you can for yourself, just to make it easier to maintain going forward. But what's really good about Apex REST is that it will do some clever work in terms of allowing us to serialize and deserialize things. So you can see here that this method here, the HTTP get method we're annotating, is going to get some languages for us, and it's going to return a list of languages. And what's really good about Apex REST is that Apex will automatically serialize a standard set of return items. So this can be a custom class, a set of objects, or set of custom objects, or a standard system class, and it will automatically serialize those into JSON or into XML if you want them in XML to be returned. So we're just going to return a list of languages as we normally would do if this were just any regular method, and Apex will go away and serialize it for us correctly. You'll notice here that I, above all of my methods, have defined the roots which are going to be matching this method. You'll see for this first one that we've actually got 2 roots. So let's talk a little bit about matching for the URL. So with each URL mapping that you define is that Apex or Salesforce will attempt to match that URL using any request. So when a request comes in, Apex will go away and take all of your URL mappings and attempt to make a match against one of those mappings. What it will do is if it finds an exact match, it will take that. Otherwise, it will go through wildcard characters and find the longest match possible. So So in this case, if we call anything which is /languages/ and then has some characters, it will match that as the longest value. If we have nothing there, it will match just /languages/. So we're going to use this same route to be able to, we're going to use the same mapping to get 2 routes. One where we just want to retrieve all the languages where we don't provide an ID, and one when we want to retrieve a specific language where we do provide an ID. And all we're doing in the method here is we're having the REST request context object. So within a RESTful resource class, you get access to this REST context object, and that has two properties on it, the request and the response. As I mentioned before, Apex is really good at serializing things to us for return values. If you wanted to use the response class, instead you could, if you want to change the response status, if you want to add extra parameters going back, or change the body in some way, you can use the REST context.response variable, and that will return a REST response object. We're getting the request one here, so that we can inspect the URI of the request and retrieve any of the characters that came after the last /. So if we're doing /languages/ID and we have an ID string in there, it will return the ID. And what we're going to do is check to see whether the ID is of length 0 or actually exists, because this method will return a 0 length string if it doesn't exist. And if there is an ID, we're going to set this list of languages to be the language with that ID. Otherwise, we're going to just select 10 languages. So I'm going to switch over to the workbench now, and what we can see is I've logged into the REST Explorer again, and I have this available new endpoint, which is Apex REST/languages. So you remember the last time we went into REST Explorer, it came up services, data, and then the version number. This is now services Apex REST to denote that you've got an Apex REST class, and then the URL mapping. So we're going to just call get with languages and no ID parameter, and you can see it's returned us a list of 10 objects, and these happen to be 10 languages. So you can look at Apex, and we can see it has a name, a type, it is object oriented, and an ID. You can look at closure and see that it's functional with another ID type, and so on and so forth. And what we're going to do now is copy this ID, and we'll append that onto the end. If we call execute, it will return just a single instance. So we've used our get methods here, and we've found that we can return both a list of languages or a single language instance. And so that's a very generic standardized get request set. It follows the normal sort of standard REST patterns for retrieving resources, and you can use that code as a generic example for most instances. What you should do, and what I haven't done here, is add some error catching code around to then return and update the REST response with an error code if you can't find the resource, or if there has been another type of error. So the next one we're going to look at is the post route, and we just have a different annotation here, which is HTTP post, and you can see we're returning a string, so it's just the ID of the language we're retrieving. And what you'll notice is in this method, we're passing parameters in. So much as Apex is very good, and Apex REST is very good at serializing items that we return into JSON, it's also very good at deserializing parameters in the response, in the request body, into out of JSON and into Apex parameters. What's really important to know is that when you're passing these parameters in, as we'll see in a minute, it doesn't matter what order they're passed in, just as long as they have the correct parameter name. So all this method is going to do is take a name, which is a string, and a type, which is a string, and it's going to create our new language and return the ID. So it's very simple, very standard. You'll notice here that we don't need to use either the REST context request or the REST context response because of this method, so you don't have to include them if you don't need them. So if we go back here, and what we're going to do is we're going to post to languages. So we can remove the ID, and we're going to create a new item, and what we're going to do is we write this in JSON format. So the name is going to be Python, and the type, well, Python can be a scripting language, Python can be object-oriented, so we're going to go with object-oriented for now, and we can update it in a minute. So that's our standard parameterization in the request body, and we execute that. And you can see it returns a string ID, which it's deserialized into characters here, display, but we can view the raw response. We can get this ID, and if we call get with that ID, then we return our new Python object. Very simple, very quick and efficient. The next method we've got is a put method. So I'm going to be showing two ways of doing puts here. So as you remember from before, a put is when you have the complete object that you're updating, the complete resource for that resource URL. So there are two ways, obviously, of updating this particular language object that we're working with. As it's only got a string and a name, we could pass in all the parameters individually. So we'll do that here. We've got the string and the name, string and the type, sorry, the name and the type. Or we could pass in the entire object, and we'll do that in a minute. So the first thing to do is, you'll see here that we're again getting the request. This allows us again to retrieve the ID, and what we're going to do is retrieve the language, set the new values on it, and then update it. So very, very simple for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to update our Python item. So we're going to call put, and what we're going to do is we're going to change the type from being object-oriented to scripting, because we happen to have decided now that it's actually a scripting language and not an object-oriented language. So do that, and it returns our object for us, and it's nicely updated. So that's one way of doing it, but that becomes very cumbersome if you've got a large number of parameters. What is easier to do is to use the object itself, and to use an S-object instance. It's rather than that's cumbersome. And what's easier to do is to use an S-object instance rather than a single. This obviously becomes cumbersome, however, when you've got a large number of parameters, and so it's easier to use an S-object instance rather than a series of parameters. So if I had 10 fields rather than the 2, it would be a long series of strings and a lot to kind of reset. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that. So let me uncomment this code and comment this code, and you can see that it's the same annotation and it's the same method signature, but all I've done is I've still got the request in here, which I can remove as I don't actually need that. And I've got the language coming in, and all I'm going to do is just call update on that language. So I can save this, wait for that to save up. I mentioned before the important thing with the deserialization of JSON into Apex or into S-objects is the name of the parameter that you're passing in. So if we go back in here now and call put again, what we need to do is just place this. So if we show the raw response, we can copy these items because we're going to be using those. So we have to use the proper field names. Oops. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap that with a language property. It's going to have our object in it. Oops. And so if we now call put, and let's set this to be back to, well, it can also be functional, why not? And it's gone away and worked. And so if we just call get on this now, you can see that it's retrieved the correct value and it's been updated. So what happened when we did the put method there, and I'll show you again, is that we've defined this parameter language in our method here, and we've defined that to be a type language _c, so the language S object. And what we've done is we've just constructed all of that S object here as a JSON object for it to be deserialized. So this is a really, really powerful thing to do, and it makes working with Apex REST really, really easy. So this doesn't just work for REST objects, it can also work for classes that you've written. So it's custom objects, standard classes, and custom Apex classes that you've written can all be managed in this way, and it makes it really, really flexible and powerful to write these simple methods. So that's done with, and we've also got patch here. So we can update just one of the values. So if we go back in, we'll remember before that the difference between put and patch is that patch works by updating just a single item in the resource rather than all of them. So all we're going to do is just again update the type back to object oriented. Let me execute that, and it updates our Python record again. And so all we've done here is it's very, very similar code to our previous code. We can see that we have the name and the type parameters. We can't here use the entire language object parameter, because if we do, then it will update the entire language object. So if we haven't had items set on there, they will be set as null in the record, which is not what we want. So what we have to do is check to see whether the values are null, and if they are not, set them correctly on the correct language. So we retrieve that using the request again, and then we just update the language. So it's very, very simple. It's just a simple statement that you've probably written lots of times for things like controllers, but it's in a slightly different context, what with the annotations and the fact it has to be a global static. The final one we've got is a delete. So what we're going to do now is just delete off our record. So again, the delete requires us to have an ID, so we get the request, we retrieve the ID, we retrieve the language, and then we delete the language, and it will return us telling the deletion's successful. So the final thing for us to do now is to press delete. We execute that, we can see that the delete was successful, and we can show the raw response, and it comes back as a string. So that's a brief overview of how all of the different annotations work with Apex REST, and how to write a very fully fledged REST system around an object construct. So if you were working with something like Rails or the Play framework, you'll have seen this kind of construct before, and this is how most modern MVC frameworks work. They use RESTful routing to do work such as this on models that get saved to a database. So you can use this if you want to do nested routing, and we'll show that in the next video, as well as doing things such as doing more complicated actions. So you could have a run action if you wanted to kick off a batch process in the background, and you can use this to integrate with all different frameworks. So this works with JavaScript and everything else. The other thing we'll see next week, as well as having nested routes, is how to use RESTful web services written in Apex on a public site, so that you can make them public and accessible for everyone, rather than having to use the REST Explorer or log in using OAuth. So that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. If you have any feedback, please tweet us at force.comcast, and please follow at force.comcast to get all of the updates and find out when new videos are released.